It's time.
Ladies and gentlemen, the GeForce GTX 1080 Ti, faster than a Titan X, and all of that for $699.
Jensen was not wrong. A top-tier GPU for $699 was definitely something to cheer about, especially if we look at the pricing of current generation of GPUs. Powered by refined Pascal architecture, the 1080 Ti was a legendary GPU that was released in March 2017. There are 3,584 CUDA cores, and Nvidia equipped it with 11GB of super-fast GDDR5X memory over 352-bit bus, allowing for nearly 500GB per second of bandwidth. The GPU has a base clock of 1481 MHz and a 250W TDP. On paper, it mostly matched Nvidia's $1,200 unicorn, the Titan X, but there was a problem. 1080 Ti was faster. Was it too good then? Perhaps it was. I don't think Nvidia ever followed up the success of the 1080 Ti, and for many, it was the best GPU ever released, period. The card I'm testing today is Gigabyte's Aorus GTX 1080 Ti Water Force Extreme Edition, which I bought back in 2018 for £520 or about $650 USD. That might seem expensive, but does anyone remember how profitable the 1080 Ti was for Ethereum mining? Yeah. Card served me well, and to this day it still runs quietly and in some games likes to boost to over 2 GHz. But let's move on to synthetic benchmarks. And as always, we start with the 3D Mark Time Spy, where the 1080 Ti scored nearly 10,500 points. When compared to its predecessor, the GTX 980 Ti, that's an astonishing 60% increase. Funny enough, the RTX 3080 is 60% faster versus the 1080 Ti. Next, 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme. 1080 Ti scored 14,132 points, keeping its 60% lead over the 980 Ti and pulling up much closer to RTX 3080. In Heaven benchmark with ultra quality and extreme tessellation dialed in, GTX 1080 Ti scored 5,589 points. This translates to about 53% lead over the 980 Ti and 34% behind the RTX 3080. Next, we look at power efficiency of the 1080 Ti. Here, the points are calculated by dividing Heaven benchmark score by peak power consumption. With a score of 22.3, 1080 Ti sits at the top of the graph, and I was not expecting it to be more efficient than a GTX 1060, but it's a no match for a newer GPUs such as the RX 5600 XT. When looking at MSRP to Heaven score ratio, 1080 Ti offers middle of the ground value. It's clearly better than the GTX 980 Ti and about the same as the GTX 1060 was. Finally, and most importantly, let's take a look at the second-hand value. 1080 Ti's are currently selling between £180 to £210 or about 230 to 270 USD, which makes them slightly less desirable than a 5600 XT or a GTX 1060. GPU prices continue to fall, and older, high-end cards will drop the most, so the 1080 Ti can only get better from here. With the synthetic benchmarks over, let's test games next. Starting off with 2019 zombie title, Days Gone, where I finally managed to beat the story mode. Game offers great visuals and runs well on the 1080 Ti. Using a very high preset at 1080p, I saw 115 FPS on average, with 1% lows at 59. At 1440p, averages dropped a bit to still playable 84 FPS, with 1% lows at 46. 4K was too much for the 1080 Ti at these settings, and averages dropped to 48 FPS on average and 1% lows to 33. That being said, just lowering the game setting to high pushed the average FPS to almost 60. Not bad of a start, right? Another 2019's title tested was Dirt Rally 2. I went with ultra settings along with 2x MSAA and 4x AF enabled. Classic Golf GTI, sunny stage in Spain, what more do you need? 1080p saw 120 FPS on average with 1% low sitting at 85. At 1440p, there's a slight drop to 91 FPS on average, with good 1% lows at 70. 4K proves to be too much at these settings once again, but despite this, 55 FPS on average is respectable, and of course, just a slight reduction to game settings would see this above 60. Quickly jumping to 2020's Doom Eternal for a change of scenery at Ultra preset. 1080 Ti had no problem to push above 200 FPS on average at 1080p, and only dropping to 163 at 1440p. Even at 4K, game was perfectly playable with 86 FPS on average and 1% lows at 59. Forza Horizon 5 up next. 1080 Ti boosted to over 2 GHz, and with Ultra preset at 1080p, ISO 119 FPS on average. 1440p was still very playable at 92 FPS, and at 4K, game ran with 63 FPS on average and 1% lows of 53. I think that's a very decent result for a 2021 title. Returning to Resident Evil Village once again, this time using prioritized graphics and high textures with 4GB of allocation. 1080 Ti demolished 1080p with 160 FPS on average and 1% lows at 125. Even at 1440p, we are looking at 114 FPS on average with decent 1% lows at 87. 4K proved to be quite a challenge, but with 62 FPS on average, it was still perfectly playable. Now, let's move on to Cyberpunk 2077. Here, I first tried the native high preset. You can clearly see this game is not easy to run. At 1080p, the Ti pushed 77 FPS on average with 1% lows at 54. Stepping up to 1440, an average FPS drops to 51. At 4K, we are looking at very cinematic 25 FPS on average. Sadly, not even this legendary GPU owns this game, so let's help by turning FSR on. With FSR set to quality, we gain nearly 30% boost to average FPS at 1080p, now running at 99. 1440p saw a huge 40% uplift to 71, and finally, 4K ran with 40 FPS on average, a 60% boost. Hey yeah, Witcher 3 is back, and once again I've tried the native high preset first, and at 1080p I saw 79 FPS on average. 1440p saw a big drop to just 42 FPS on average with 1% lows at 32. 4K was absolutely a no-go for the 1080 Ti, with average FPS of just 16. Both Cyberpunk and Witcher 3 seem to be very demanding. I wonder what these two games have in common. FSR to rescue? We can certainly try. 1080p saw a nice 51% uplift to 119 FPS on average. 1440p jumped by 81% to much more enjoyable 75 FPS on average. And finally, 4K saw a 101% uplift to 33 FPS on average. Being honest, I really don't like those numbers. Of course, the game looks better, but it's embarrassing for a 1080 Ti to struggle with a game that recommends the GTX 1070 for optimal gameplay. And speaking of demanding games, here's Microsoft's Flight Simulator to finish off game testing. I've used high-end graphical preset and saw 44 FPS on average with rather poor 1% lows at 28. Looking at the GPU usage, which was hovering around 60% most of the time, I'm pretty sure this game needs further updates to run smoother. And there you have it guys, GTX 1080 Ti, the legend, finally tested. Those results speak for themselves. When Nvidia released this GPU, I doubt they knew it would hold up this well and for this long. In my view, 1080 Ti was the final form of the GTX lineup as we knew it. I'm sorry, 1600 series owners. Looking at the results of game testing, I think 1440p is where this card shines. But should you buy one in 2023? Let's take a look at positives. Firstly, 11GB of VRAM is plenty. There's also a decent amount of CUDA cores for productivity and enough performance at 1080p, allowing for high refresh rate gaming. The only downside I can think of is the relatively higher power consumption, and that the GPU pricing puts the 1080 Ti in a weird spot. You see, there's a lot of pressure from more modern mid-range cards, which are now priced very similarly but offer better efficiency and are technically younger, perhaps offering a greater peace of mind for many years to come. I believe 1080 Ti still has its place and shouldn't be avoided, for as long as it has Nvidia's driver support. Have you ever owned a GTX 1080 Ti or still use one today? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.